Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Values as the Spark, Changing Power Dynamics, Better Water Decisions. This is a session that is, it seems, right at the middle of the Stockholm Water Week, half day through lunchtime on the Wednesday. And I can see a whole lot of people are tuning in to see what we want to discuss here. At a point when doing this year's topic, water topic, valuing water, the topic has already been discussed in a couple of sessions, and we right in the middle of this week are going to take a look at where the rubber hits the road on valuing water, what it means when you apply it, and what it means when you're trying to figure out how to use values to get to better water decisions. We have a beautiful panel here assembled for you, hosted by Martin Gischler of the Dutch Ministry for Foreign Affairs. We have, I think you can see the names and the titles of everyone out there on the session description, so we won't go much deeper into that. But as we're starting with the session, I wanted to give you a couple of pointers on how we're going to run this. First of all, my name is Monica Weber-Farr. I will be your host today. In real life, I'm a senior advisor with the World Bank's Water Solutions Group. And what we would like you to note during this session is, first of all, you have this screen here that where you see us, the speakers, and other things. At the same time, you will see on your right, on the second tab, a place where it says poll. And where it says poll, we will ask you and invite you in a moment to actually help us with some answers. There's also a chat function, and we would like to invite you to take a look at the chat functions, to provide some questions and thoughts and that you're seeing there, so that we can react to them if possible at all. In the meantime, I think we're at a good place now where we can start having a conversation and asking you for some of your views. First of all, when you see the first question under the polls question, the first question should be, why are you here? We're giving you a couple of options. You know, one of the presenters. The session mentioned the word values, and that attracted you. The session mentioned the word power dynamics, and that attracted you. You're not quite sure why you're here, or maybe you're wondering where you are. So if I could invite you to respond to, various questions that you see here with one of the options, then we can see whom we have all together here. Now we should be seeing live how this comes out. I think the first 2 or 3 people have already responded. Can I get a few more responses from everyone? We see how it live moves. So we have a whole bunch of people who are here because they know a presenter. And I don't think we've got anybody here who doesn't know where they are. So a little fan club out there, I can see that. And more people interested in the topic of values than in the topic of powers. Then let's go from here to the next question, which is, I'm aware of the Valuing Water Initiative. And Martin will speak to that in a moment a bit more, but before he does that, we wanted to hear from you what you know about the Valuing Water Initiative. So again, here you've got a couple of options. You're not at all aware of it. You've heard of it. It's something Dutch, you think. You've read some of their documents and you know them well. So it would be great if you could vote for any one of those options. And we can already see some of the poll results here. So there's a couple of people who know them very well. Some are not, a couple of people who don't know anything at all. But by and large, I think we've got a mixed audience, and nobody seems to have read the documents. Well, that's not really true, because you can only choose one option. So perhaps some people know them well and have read their documents. But I think here, Martin, you've got the enviable task of speaking to folks who are kind of half and half in knowing you well and not knowing very much at all. And now here comes then the third question that we wanted to ask you. But as we are asking the third questions, which is, can leveraging people's values change power dynamics? I wanted for us here just to define the term values. Values, the way we're going to use the term here in this session, are basic and fundamental beliefs that guide or motivate attitude or actions. Values are defined as something that helps us determine what is important to us. In a narrow sense, they are what is good, desirable, or worthwhile. But in a more broader sense, we can understand them as the motive behind what we consider purposeful action. So if you consider that as the definition of values, we would like to hear from you on our third question. The third question is, what do you think? Do you think leveraging people's values can change power dynamics and ignite system change? So by appealing to leveraging, working with people's values, can power dynamics be changed and can system change be ignited? And we're giving you a couple of options. One is no chance, very unlikely. I wish, but I don't think so. I've seen it work. And the last one is system change can actually not work unless you leverage values. So be curious to see whether we have anyone here who has seen it work. And it seems we've got a couple of you who've seen it work, which are the folks in violet here. Nobody here says no chance. So that's for the rest of us. We don't have a whole lot of doubters in this group, in this audience. And that also means probably that we need to switch on our own personal doubter so that we can have a bit of a devil's advocate conversation with ourselves. Because indeed, and what you will hear from others during this session is, it's not always easy to convince people to go on a change path that mobilizes values as at the get-go or at the start. Now, with that question, I think we are now moving into Martin's conversation, Martin's discussion of values, power dynamics, and better water decisions, the Valuing Water Initiative. Martin, tell us more about it.
Yeah, thank you, Monica, and thanks to all the participants who are in this session. Maybe the first slide. Let's start macro. I first saw this graph in the Dasgupta review, The Economics of Biodiversity, earlier this year. And it shows that for the past century, mainstream economists have celebrated gains in produced capitals and have ignored the decline in natural capital. They've ignored climate change, biodiversity loss, water crisis. And Dasgupta now concludes in a mainstream report that economic logic has basically been misapplied. The economy is embedded in nature and there's not much to celebrate in a zero-sum economy. Now let's view this through a values lens. What does society find important? Like Monica said in her introduction, different groups will prioritize these three different categories of wealth in different ways, but some groups have more influence on decisions than others, and the consequences show in this graph. It is systemic. So the system as it is kind of self-destructive, and we see that here in the biosphere, and it needs to change. The question is how? What role can values play? How do power dynamics change? Who leads? Who follows? So let's unpack that. Now the Valuing Water Initiative tries to figure this out. Water is the bloodstream for the biosphere, as was mentioned in the introduction of this Stockholm Water Week. It's also the bloodstream for society and for the economy. That makes it a relevant entry point for system change. So our initiative launched in 2019, implementing the recommendations of the high-level panel on water and applying its 5 valuing water principles. Mariana and Lucy will later on in this session tell their story from Tanzania using those principles. Now, what levers can we pull in systems change? What carrots, what sticks? How can we improve water use behavior, promote equal access to water and sanitation, reduce water risk, etc.? Is technology going to save us? Will tariffs do the job? Government regulations? Could values provide the spark, which is today's focus, and what leverage should we assign to it? New business models, maybe? Or should we bet on all of the above in an idea of paradigm change? Next slide. Let's go a bit deeper into values, power dynamics, and decision-making. Later in the session, Christopher will explain a water-related values framework that he developed in his PhD research and that we find useful. Monica already explained what we mean with values. So what do we mean with valuing? That is basically the weighing of one thing, one goal or object against others. Apples and oranges, if you will. Now, as circumstances change, groups may revisit their priorities. Certain values get activated and others deactivated. That can happen at an individual level, at a collective level, or at an institutional level. Of course, more impact when it's institutional. And what then is valuing water? It's weighing water-related goals against other goals and weighing impact and consequences of pursuing those other goals on water. So in an SDG context, it's not about SDG 6 per se, it's about water as an enabler in the context of all SDGs. And power dynamics, certain groups are more influential than others, so their values have more influence, and vested interest will always be a challenge. That's what we will have to deal with. My last slide. So how does systems change work? It's a growing field of research, and having a framework for systems change is key. Without it, you fly blind. We adjust our framework as we go along in a multidisciplinary collaboration. Our hypothesis is in the top row that systems change goes through 4 stages. Inception, first movers, gaining critical mass, and then institutionalization. Transition from one stage to the next only happens in response to appropriate levers being pulled. Too early, a lever won't do much, and skipping stages is not an option. The model also has feedback loops and reinforcement loops, but I'll not go into that. Now, our initiative has looked at 14 cases worldwide, and with our support, the stakeholders in those cases filled in this framework and tested if it can explain their trajectory. We try to understand who led the process: government, industry, science, civil society, etc. Who was dragging their feet, and sometimes the sequence changes when you move from one stage to the next. We find a lot of diversity. Sometimes government lead in regulation, sometimes it's social activism of the technological innovation that leads. And we'll make results available on the Valuing Water Initiative website shortly. Our framework seems to be able to explain what happened and clarify why change processes got stuck, why certain interventions failed, and why others succeeded. And if we can explain the past with this framework, then that may also be of some use to guide us to the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. And thank you for walking us through this perspective of the Valuing Waters Initiative. You might want to prepare yourself for a question that we'll ask you at the end once we've heard some of the examples, is where you have seen specifically values making a difference. Because and that is often, I think, the question that we're all asking ourselves is what makes the difference between a regular project and a project that consciously and mindfully deploys values and thinks about and considers how we value water or how our values drive us on topics that do relate to water. Now, with that, I'd like to transition us to the first of the 2 examples. that we'll introduce here, and Mariana Borges of IUCN and Lucy Fulgense of SNV will talk us through this. And I think, Mariana, you're located in the UK, I believe, and Lucy in Tanzania, right?
Yes.
So over to you, telling us what is it that makes the Khatuma Basin case so special. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Monica. And I'm actually based in Switzerland, but close enough. Yeah, I'm in IUCN headquarters, which is in Switzerland. But yeah, so I'm here to talk to you about the Khatuma Basin case study together with Lucy. And in the next slide, I'll just introduce the program under which the Khatuma Basin case study happened, which is Sustain Africa, the Sustainability and Inclusion Strategy for Growth Corridors in Africa, which was a program that was going on from 2014 up to 2020. And it was focused both in Tanzania and Mozambique. But I think what's really interesting about Sustain was that what we were doing was focusing on how you get systemic change, i.e. going from business as usual to kind of development models that look at inclusive and climate resilient development. And we were doing this through several different levers, as per Martin's presentation, which I think resonate well in looking at, for example, how you move from, a perspective that looks at individual gain to shared value. What are the business models that can help you get to that? And, what are the policies and governance changes that are needed for that to happen? Next slide, please. And so Khatuma is actually in Tanzania, and it's one of the 6 subbasins of Lake Rukwa Basin in Western Tanzania. And basically, this is part of the Southern Agricultural Growth Corridor of Tanzania, which is an area of Tanzania that has been earmarked for rapid economic growth. And because of this area went through very rapid infrastructure and economic growth and development, which resulted in land use change. And with that came several challenges, such as kind of deforestation, biodiversity decline, water, scarcity that kind of reduced availability and flow for people and for the businesses working in Khatuma. And with that also conflicts that came from that. And that's where we came in through Sustain together with SNV. And, we looked at solutions that were kind of values-based to address and to lead to result in systemic change. So I'll pass over to Lucy, who will go through what we did in detail.
Thank you, Mariana. I'm Lucy. I'm Deputy Country Director for SNV based here in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. So yeah, thank you, Mariana, for that background. So to address the challenges in order to ensure better decisions impacting water were guided by 5 value water principles throughout the implementation of Sustain project. The Sustain project key element was to consider the multiple values to the different stakeholders, the economic values, the personal values in all the decisions that are affecting the Khatuma River, which meant that we look from the eyes of its users in order to build the collaborations that allowed for a more inclusive and participatory platform that can enable voices of different users, the agriculturists, the pastoralists, the fisheries, the ecologists, the environmentalists, and the tourist branches to be heard in an equitable setting, empowering the vulnerable, let's say the lesser heard voices and the values. So this enabled the water users to identify and map the problems and root causes of unsustainable outcomes. Because one of the biggest issues in these communities was actually the downplaying of the problem. Then reconcile these values and build trust in a collaborative and multi-stakeholder platform. We supported the building of water use associations, which are responsible for monitoring water and implementing a vision for the catchment. Strategies were also developed to protect the sources with the support of the local government authorities, Lake Rukwa Basin and the national park authorities, the illegal water channels were taken down to protect the sources. So preventing the water loss and restoring the landscape and taking down the illegal water channels in the region. There was also capacity building track for water stakeholders, the farm organization, pension workers, and the agro-pastoralists on the themes related to sustainable agricultural development in order to stimulate the leadership and ownership. So enhancement of multi-stakeholder platforms and building capacity for agricultural market cooperative society was also key. For the purpose of financial sustainability, there was also establishment of the build, operate, transfer financing strategy, which investors put money in an improved irrigation scheme, thereby improving the yield by which rice farmers would pay in the entrepreneurs in terms of bags of rice, thereby enabling the returns of investment with some profits and enabling the ownership of the system to be transferred to the water use associations. So the key takeaway here is really the change that can be achieved through the journey of partnership is that builds from the shared vision, reconciliation of value, unity, and purpose. In terms of the lessons learned, you can see here in these slides, there are a few lessons learned, but I just want to focus on a key message from the lessons learned. And that has to do in terms of how we monitored the outcomes. So integrated outcomes can only be reached if the monitoring practices are also adjusting accordingly. So if there are separate monitoring goals for water, separate monitoring goals for agriculture, and separate monitoring goals for policymaking, then it's very complicated and to later then integrate them with the project goals. So instead, highlighting earlier on in the connectedness between the different disciplines and sectors, which is what happened in the sustained case, can bring about the systemic change that is needed to solve complex problems as the Katuma showcase. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy and Maria Anna. Before I'm going in and asking you a few more questions about this experience, or rather 5, 6, 7 year worth of work, I would like to turn to our audience. You might want to please go back into your screen, again, back to that section where it says polls, and scroll down to where we left it off last. And I think this would now take us to question number, is it 5 or 4? 4. In your experience, getting a group of unconnected water users, which is what the team at the Katuma Basin has done, to agree on the mechanism for what is predictable and regulated water sharing. Is that very, very hard to do? Is that often impossible without some extra investment? Can it work if you're lucky? Or does it usually work? Or is this an everyday type of experience for water professionals? So can we see your votes in here? And I see many people think it's very hard or often impossible to do. Some actually think that's what water professionals do work on every day, so it's kind of normal. At the moment, we have a majority of people finding this quite tough, and a quarter or so of people who are looking at this as their regular type of job. So that gives us a good intro into the next question, which is, noting that some of you found this practically impossible, what was achieved and the Katuma Basin, and other thing it was maybe just normal. We look at the next question. We're wanting to hear your view based on what you've just heard. What role, in your view, based on what you've just heard, did the mobilization of values play in the Katuma project? So do you think economic values played a role? This was about people wanting to keep their future incomes? Do you think it was about personal values? This was about people caring for each other. We've heard about the different engagements with the more vulnerable people, with the farmers associations, water associations. Do you think values didn't really matter massively? A central mechanism alone could solve a collective action problem? Or did you also think values wasn't really the big point here? This was a regular water project that needed a solution. So if you would like to give your vote based on what you've heard, that will help us go a bit deeper in the questions here. So I can see a lot of people think economic values were the main driver here. Some people think personal values also, and then we've got that group of folks that think this was just a regular water project. And mind you, one of the things I think that the Valuing Water Initiative has discovered, and maybe Martin wants to comment on that at the end, is that the experience of the Dutch government going through all their water projects has shown that in a number of cases, values played a lot of, had a big importance, played a big role, even though people didn't realize it or didn't mindfully deploy it as a lever. And in other cases, it didn't. So here we see that people felt that in this project, the economic values made the biggest difference here. And so let me send that question directly here to Lucy. Lucy, many things happened as part of the project. We've just heard a few in this 5-6 minutes that you had. Throughout the project, can you tell me where paying attention to values played the most important role? Perhaps more important than other things. And as you said, in the end, there were a number of really interesting lessons, including about KPIs and monitoring, and that it makes sense to have consistent monitoring throughout and not play to different donors' preferences, but stay the course on that. So there were important technical lessons too. But in addition to that, where during the project did paying attention to value play the most important role? Lucy.
Thank you. I would say that throughout the project, paying attention to values was critical. When you look at the economic values, the personal values, there were some conflicting values for water management across the different players in the Katuma catchment. So first, values was key in creating the awareness in terms of recognizing that there is a problem, played a key role, and what that problem was to each stakeholder, and not playing down the problem and the wish to continue business as usual, which was the root causes of this unsustainable outcome in the Katuma catchment. So once this was achieved, was now how do we establish this shared vision that will bring about the results that we want to achieve, which meant that we fostered the collaboration, established these platforms for bringing together water users through establishment of the water user associations, and really ensuring the inclusive participatory platform. So, so it's really important that there is alignment in terms of the values that leads up to the vision, and how those can be channeled together to bring about water management is key. You know, because once these stakeholders understood the problem and that they have understood that water, for example, is not free and they need to pay for water in order to make sure there's enough water. Once they understood this, they also started to feel the need for structured guidance for the water resources and improved decision-making process and practices. So I would say valued played a key role throughout the project, but more specifically at the beginning where we're creating the awareness and recognizing the problems.
So this was about really opening up, making people aware of who brings what values to the table, right? And I think you had also mentioned that that different people had different perceptions. Initially, the community wasn't really looking at things. Now, let me ask Maria Anna a question here that relates to personal interests then, or if you will, economic interest. In one of your publications, you speak about setting up interest-driven partnerships, where every partner comes to the table with their own interests. Did the work on values help you figure out what the difference is between different parties and then have them come together, or how did that happen?
Thanks, Monica. Yeah, well, I think that, yes, there's a bit of a divide between what your interest is and your values. I guess the values are underlying to your interests. And actually you can have, you know, when you come to the table, you come with an agenda, which may represent some of your values, but may go beyond them. And they may be associated to the institution that you represent, or, you know, a lot comes into play when interests are considered. But what we wanted to do with the work that we did was looking at, you know, knowing that each person and each institution will come with their interests, but at the end of the day, look at where the commonalities are in those interests and looking at how you can create shared value. So it was going from a kind of, you know, introspective view to a kind of understanding where all the other, you know, people in the room lie, and kind of creating that moment of sharing and creation. So that was, I mean, I think that's what we meant by the interest-driven partnerships. And it's also about realizing that you won't always, you know, align your interests, and therefore you might not always get to a place, or you might not be ready to get to a place of shared values. But you know, if there is that kind of touch point, then you can build something that goes from this individual gain and action to collective action and eventually systemic change. And those were some of the levers that we were working on in the different components of Sustain.
Thank you. And in the interest of time, rather than digging further into that, I'd just like to ask you first, Lucy, and then Maria Anna, the survey just now, where did values play a role? Mainly economic values, mainly personal values, or was this really not a values project? Lucy, what would have been your vote?
I would have said economic values played a big role, as well as personal values. So definitely.
So you would have tried to tick on both, and if you
Yes.
had only one option, which one would it be?
I would say that economic values was a bigger one, because even when we were trying to come up with the solution, it started from because of the economic influence and how the regulatory environment was also influenced by this small business, the big businesses that are around in the catchment area.
Thank you. Mariana?
Yeah, I also voted for economic, though I think it's difficult to choose one, to be honest, because I think they're intertwined, especially in a place like Atuma.
Thank you. And this is a good transition, because when I was listening to you, my own conclusion was economic values at the surface was the main driver for the solution. But if one had really insisted of everybody getting what they thought would have been their fair share, there may not have been a conclusion. And there must have been values such as the value of cooperation, the value of wanting to work together, the value of wanting to achieve a resolution, that also then in the end played a role in coming together in this very difficult situation. Now, we will now transition to the other case, where economic values played a lesser role and where the main driver are personal values. We will hear from Sanjay Pahuja and from Meseret Asefa. Sanjay Pahuja is with the World Bank, and Meseret Asefa is with the Addis Water Authority. I think, Sanjay, you will speak first and explaining to us what this obscure sounding field level leadership program is, where you both worked with the Addis Ababa Water and Sewerage Authority on empowering the rank and file. Over to you, Sanjay.
Thanks, Monica. Hello, everyone. So we are all looking for good ideas to make a change in the world, a positive change. And that's why we are here. And we work very hard on design. We look for new technologies, processes, new systems that can make the change. But with all that effort, we end up like this guy that you see here. His wagon is ready. He wants to go, but he isn't going anywhere because there's no horse. So even our best designed projects do not change anything unless there are people on the ground who are going to implement those beautifully designed elements, who are willing to fight to change the behaviors and systems that have been there for decades or hundreds of years. And if we don't pay attention to that, we're not going anywhere. That's why more than half of the reforms in water sector do not succeed. So let's think about, how does the world look from the perspective of those who are on the ground at the field level? Next slide, please. Here are 3 people working on repairing a pipe in Uganda. Let's imagine it's summertime, it's Friday afternoon, and one of them gets a call saying the pipe has broken. Now we know what kind of dysfunctional environments exist in most public agencies around the world. The fact is, it's totally fine for these guys to just go home and say, hey, we'll look at it on Monday. In fact, that's what most of their colleagues are doing. There's no penalty for that, and there's no reward for working hard. So why would these people go 10, 15 miles away on a bad road and work for hours in heat and dust to fix this pipe? There is no innovative technology, there is no reform, no law, no policy that can make those guys work. If they work, and we know there are people like that, if they work, it's because of something within them, their values, their pride and commitment to their work, their sense of connection with their communities. And it also helps if they have a friend who says, come on, man, get on my motorcycle, we'll go together. So how do we create that kind of culture that can bring that change? And when we ask that question, we always ask, well, you need a good leader. And by leader, we think of someone at the top of the organization, a superhero. But, you know, that kind of leader, committed, passionate, hardworking, politically clever, that exists at every level. 10 to 15% of the people in any village, at any level, in any organization have that profile. They are the good guys. They're always doing their good work. But unlike the bad guys, the corrupt guys who are very well connected, the good people, they are not connected with each other. So they are lonely. They feel depressed. But what if you could find them? Next slide, please. What if you could connect them with each other? What if they could support each other and you could make a little bit of space where they can exercise their potential to be leaders? That is what is field level leadership. And unlike most leadership programs which focus on the top layer of management, because that's what we think of as leaders, field level leadership looks at everyone in the organization and thinks and creates space for them to become leaders. And that's what Mesret is going to share with you of how it was applied in Addis. Thank you.
Mesret?
Okay, so hi everyone. So as Sanjay was saying, Addis Ababa Water and Sewerage Authority was very much interested in the unique idea of FLA. So we started implementing FLA back in 2019. Next slide, please. So yeah, FLA within it's a core concept. It had an attractive concept to AUSA. So AUSA wanted to change the mindset of its employees so that the employees could have a sense of belongingness and ownership towards their organization, which would lead to a committed and innovative staff. And of course, at the end of the day, there would be a high efficiency and sustainability of service delivery, which would enable us to satisfy the customers. So AUSA was very much interested in FLA. Next slide, please. So with that in mind, back in 2019, AUSA selected 19 employees from among every department and sent to Chennai, India to take the FLL training. So the 19 people came back and did all the facility for the training and conducted 20 rounds of trainings for 600 employees for selected branches of Addis Katama and Arada branches in our utility. So then after the training, there were also follow-up, regular follow-ups done with the help of the management and also the trainers in Chennai. Next slide, please. So the key results achieved while implementing FLL were very much satisfactory. As you can see from regarding revenue and bill collection, reduction of non-revenue water, increase in both water and sanitation services, we were able to see or observe a lot of change because of just FLL without any additional resource or without any additional system or policy or anything at work. So to achieve this, for example, I could give you some examples how these changes were achieved. For example, in revenue and bill collection, there were individual initiations to make sure that customers to reach out to customers so that they could be aware of their unpaid bills in using social medias, different platforms, and other means of communication, which was very effective when compared to the traditional way of just disconnecting water meters when people are not paying their bills. So of non-revenue water, there were individual initiations from employees to reduce the wastage of water. For example, you can see there was a vacuum truck service clerk where she observed a water loss while she was conducting her regular job, and she bought a mechanical water saving tool by using her own money, and she was able to save 1 meter cube per day of wasted water. So this is one individual effort you could see. Same is true for sanitation and water services. There were individual initiations to make sure that the sanitation service is provided in a better way, like for example, creating clearing up space in a sludge transfer station where the service was improved so that more vacuum trucks could be accommodated in the space. And also there is a limit in a hose limit, 30 meters hose limit to connect to the household, and individual initiations were made to improve those to 42 meters of connection where unreachable customers were able to reach just by individual initiations. Same is true for water supply. Collectively, there was a revision of water supply schedule so that even customers who used to get one day of the week water service for 1 day of the week were able to get 3 days per week. So in a very short way, these are all just the results we have achieved using FLL. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Messi. That every time I see that last slide that you were showing with what was achieved, I keep wondering what I personally think was most important. And every time I come out differently, whether you increase incomes by 50% or whether I'm able to move from 1 day to 3 days in terms of serving the poorest. I think probably everybody will have their own view on this, but I think what we all can agree that the achievements were significant that you managed to get to in Addis through this program. Now, dear participants, we wanted to hear what you were thinking based on what you've heard. So if you would go back to your slides, the polls tab in your system there, where we wanted to hear from you. The question, have you yourself witnessed an actual example or experience when you saw values as a key driver or igniter of changing systems? Have you seen that somewhere? So if you can get a vote there, so you can say, you've been part of such a change process, and clearly Messi would probably say yes, she's been part of a process in an organization, or maybe you've seen that you've been part of such a process in a political system or country. You can say that you've not actually seen it and don't think it actually works, and maybe take the last 5 minutes off your radar screen for that. You've read about such process, or you imagine that values can ignite change, but you have not experienced it. So would love to hear your vote here and see what you're coming out with. No poll results yet. I can see, oops. Do we have a problem with the poll, Miriam? I don't seem to be able to see the results.
Maybe not enough people have voted yet.
Okay. So this would be question number 6, I think, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, here we go. So here we can see that many people have read about such processes. We've got very few doubters. That's the kind of thing that we felt already at the beginning. There are not too many people in the room that don't really say they've not seen it and they don't think it can actually work, but we've got some. And so let's be mindful that we have a room here full of people who either have seen it or would like to see it or could imagine it to work. Now, with that, let's go to the next question. And perhaps that's only for those that have seen such change processes, either in organizations or countries. In your view, what would be the minimum share of people that it takes for something like that to be successful? You've seen the various seminars that the the Water Authority did with their staff, and they're actually not really seminars. There were offsite workshops, offsite retreats, really. Retreats where people spend time with each other and reflected on their values and how they motivated them and drove them to their own personal decisions regarding work. So how many of such people who feel motivated by their values to work differently will it take to flip a poor performing organization and turn it into a successful one? What do you think? 5% or less? 5 to 15%? Or more, half of the organization really, or at least 80%. Maybe you can also think of the organizations that you work with yourself, where you say, how many people, wow, I can see here so far, we've got a wide spectrum of folks. There's the biggest chunk so far of people seems to think that, that we need between 5 and 15%. Some say 5% or less are enough. And we've got a few people who say at least half of the organization, and not negligible people who say at least 80%, which was my first reaction, where I thought, maybe one does need really, really a big chunk of people. Let me turn to Meseret with that question. How many people did it take in your experience at Addis to, if you will, flip the organizational culture towards high performance in percentage of total staff, roughly, not scientifically tested, but roughly?
So yeah, just roughly, I would say we were just observing what's going on side by side. I mean, we were giving the training and also seeing how people are reacting to the training and how they are implementing it. So when we observed side by side what's going on, I would say when we were halfway to our training, that means when half of the institution employees were trained, we could see a significant number of changes. We could see a significant number of efforts made towards making the institution a better place. So I would say half of, I don't know, this may not work for every institution, but in my experience, while we were halfway through the training and while we trained half of the staff in the institution, we were able to see a very significant change and very significant contribution towards changing the organization
in the atmosphere. But if I can dig a little bit deeper here, you brought pretty much everyone to these workshops, and you say after about having brought half of them, you saw change, but not all of the participants after having attended a workshop would also become a change agent, right? Some probably attended a workshop and said, oh, that's kind of interesting, but it's not my cup of thing, and I'm kind of fine with how I'm doing. Or would you say the majority of people who attended these workshops were actually, if you will, ignited to become change agents?
Oh, okay. So you mean the ones who participated in the training? So you're asking me. Oh, the ones who participated in the training, majority of them were ignited, I would say. I mean, FLL has that quality. I mean, it literally drives everyone to go somewhere. It's not something you really, resist. So I would say anyone who participated in the training, majority of them, I would say, were very much ignited to contribute something, at least one thing, to change something in the institution. So yeah.
Thank you. And that gets me to a question that I wanted to ask Sanjay. Sanjay, in organizations like a water provider, there's a set power structure. And what something like FLL does, it seems to turn around or flip the power structure upside down. Is that a key element of change here?
Thanks. No, that's a very important question. You do need some willingness at the top to devolve, to give some power away. But the bigger part is not that. I think most leaders are willing and open to doing that. The bigger part is, who do you give that power to? Are there people who are willing to take that power? And who are they? And I want to take the example of Meseret. Meseret was a person in the legal department and nobody knew her. But now she's leading the FLL agenda in Addis. And at that time, nobody knew that Meseret has that potential. We didn't know Greta Thunberg was going to be a leader. We didn't know Rosa Parks was going to be a leader. So what you have to do is create that space, because we essentially do not know where change will come from. And once we have, what is beautiful about FLL is that it's an operational approach. It has been tried in 12 or 14 organizations with fantastic results. And since we work with very large numbers, there's generally, you're going to have 10 or 20 or 40 people who are going to come out with those change agenda and be successful at that.
Thank you. With that point that you've just made about creating the space for values conversations to be possible, for people to be able to engage in it, I'd like to transition to our next speaker, Christopher Schultz. He's a researcher at the University of Cambridge, and he has done some interesting background research with the Valuing Water initiative, taking a look at what is that relationship between values and power structures and decision-making in the end. And before I turn this over to Christopher, I just wanted to point everyone also to the chat function. We have 3 questions there right now who came at different points, at least the 3 that I can see, unless there's more that I can't see. So we'll turn to them. If you do have any questions to either Sanjay or Messi or Lucy and Anna Maria, or now later to Christopher, also Martin, please point them there so that we can dig a little bit deeper in there. But now over to you, Christopher.
Yeah, thanks very much, Monica, for the introduction. Yes, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the conceptual thinking around valuing water differently, which is my main task as the lead researcher for the Valuing Water initiative. And as Monica mentioned, I'm also working for the University of Cambridge as a research associate. Yeah, next slide, please. So this conceptual thinking around valuing water that emerged from my PhD research, as also was mentioned earlier in the session by Martin. And that all started with a very simple question, which was, how do values matter for taking decisions about water? And before developing this framework, this was the main guiding question that I used to develop the framework, thinking in what way can we think about values and what difference does it make for taking decisions about water? And what quickly emerged from that question is that different people have a different understanding of what are values, in fact. And we've heard a little bit about that earlier today. So some people think of economic values, some people think of personal values, and all these different kinds of values I have found actually work together to influence decisions about water. So what we have done here in this conceptual framework is to map them in a way. If we look to the bottom left, we have their assigned values, water values. Those are the kinds of values that economists would often look at. So to ask, how is water important for a city? Can we produce hydropower there? Can we use it for domestic supply? Is that water valuable for irrigation and so on? So what value does water have? That is one way of looking at values. A very different way to look at values is fundamental values, which is on the top on the previous slide. Sorry. So these are the sort of personal guiding principles where we think about how do I take a decision about water, but also about everything else in life. So that is a much more fundamental level. And then in between.
Did we just lose Christopher?
Yep.
Okay, we may just want to continue. Martin, do you want to continue? If not,
I will find it hard to tell Christopher's story, actually.
well, then let me take a stab, and in the meantime, maybe Miriam, you can figure out what happened to him. What you can see here is that values landscape of different values that Christopher had defined, which in their research they found is driving water politics. And from the water politics, which is where the power dynamics take place, then polity, i.e. the institutions, or actual policy, which are the rules and regulations, get decided. But it is the moment of the politics themselves is where the power dynamics between different players come out. And depending on which values you give space to or have a chance to succeed, that will then drive more or less the eventual outcomes in terms of polity or policy. Now, what the research that Christopher and his colleagues have done was made it so interesting. If you take a look at the next slide, is that they dug deeper into what fundamental values actually mean. Typically, we tend to think in terms of values. Are you back, Christopher?
If you would like, I can make another attempt. Sorry about the connectivity issues there.
So if you can just go into the fundamental values now.
Yeah, I'm seeing that open now. Yeah, really sorry about that. So the fundamental values, that is based on a theory developed by a social psychologist, which has been used by thousands of researchers in the past, has been applied to anything from water to any decision that you can imagine. And what these researchers have found is that people across cultures, across ages, gender, everyone shares 10 basic values. So we all think it's important to help our neighbors, things like benevolence. We all value security, living in a safe environment, self-direction, taking our own decisions. That matters to everyone. But what is different between people is how we prioritize one over the other. So in one decision, we may say, if it was me, I'm ready to take a risk. So I would prioritize self-direction or stimulation, whereas someone else may say, I prioritize security in this particular moment. So although everyone would think these values are important, they differ in how we prioritize them. And yes, here is an example of how we could apply this to a concrete case, and I'll be brief here since we've lost some time. Just thinking of the situation where people are debating, should we build a dam or not? That will affect a community, of a remote community maybe. And here's what kinds of values might be in the mind of a villager who would be affected by that dam. They may say, oh, we prefer to keep our traditions. If we have the dam, we won't be able to sustain those. We prefer decisions that are guided by social justice, participation. We want to keep fishing and biodiversity in our river and so on. And that may lead then to, on the right-hand side, in the realm of decisions to resistance to political and economic elites, and saying, as a policy, we will prefer to have no dam. And then we can contrast that with the different approach. Next, please. And we can click one more time to make it easier to look at. These might be the values that might be on the mind of someone who does support the policy of building a dam. So they will be more guided in that concrete situation by saying, well, we want hydropower, and that is a sense related to the personal values of power and achievement, making a difference, and so on. So all these different layers of values come into play when we think about decisions that affect water. That is the main message on this slide. So having that in mind, we have developed a global survey around valuing water for this Valuing Water initiative, where the purpose is to understand the values that guide people like you who are in the audience, whose decision might impact water, since most previous research has been done with citizens, with normal people, but not with the professionals who actually impact water. This survey that we have developed is available in all the UN languages, will be open at least until the end of September. A link will be shared with you in the chat, so we would really appreciate if you could take the survey. One benefit of that is that you can learn about your own values, so you will get a score of how do you score on these different value scales, and also we will use those results to inform the priorities of the Valuing Water initiative, and will of course also share them with whoever took our survey. So to conclude, the key takeaway messages from this bit of the talk is, before we talk about values, we need to be sure, what do we mean by values? Are we thinking of economic values? Are we thinking of personal values or values related to governance? And the other messages, I think, are not new to everyone in this session. So how our personal values influence how we take decisions. And if we make them visible, we can take better decisions. So with that in mind, we would really appreciate everyone's help in participating in our survey, so we better understand how different water professionals do take decisions around water policy and how those decisions are influenced by their values. Yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you, Christopher, and also compliments to Martin and the Valuing Water initiative for going on such a path with that survey to see what amongst us water professionals we consider relevant values, particularly when we look at the different dimensions. And I took that survey myself yesterday to just check it out, and I was quite surprised to see that there are values that I normally don't think of as values noted in there, such as my own sense of curiosity, or how much I value career advancement, or how much I value community. So things that are clearly, and I have to admit, the drivers of decision makings, of personal decision making, do come across there. Martin, one of the things that struck me when I was looking at the work that you're doing with Christopher here is that there are so many different values out there. And it seems that in decision making, some are rated higher or drive decisions more than others, probably more those that are associated with particular power elements. Now, can you just speak about the Valuing Water initiative, and are you trying to change the dominance of some values over others? Or, perhaps giving more power to, say, water conservation decisions if they are not so much coming to the fore? Or, how can you explain the intent of the Valuing Water initiative in terms of these many different values out there? Martin?
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, I'm unmuted. Yeah. I think that, I think we should not suggest that there is only one type of values, and that, and we should also be careful. Values, we know these particularly these fundamental values, they don't change. They change over generations, but they don't change. But what can happen is that values get activated. And I think, the first slide that I showed with the produced capital that goes up, the human capital that inches a little bit higher, and then natural capital that goes down, that shows, for instance, that, certain values dominate global decision-making more than others. At the same time, we also know now, and the Dasgupta report, for instance, helps us understand that, this is a path of self-destruction. So even if production is your, is your priority thing, you cannot continue to do that if you do not take care of nature. If you do not realize that production and the economy is embedded in nature, it's part of, nature is part of the economy. So I think in making that clearer, it can activate certain values, and it can activate certain values, for instance, in businesses, in governments who may reconsider building a mega dam, because there may be other alternatives that make more sense if you consider those three different classes of capital: production, produced, human, and.
So if I'm hearing you right, one intent of the Valiant Water Initiative is to create space for the many values to come to the fore. And with that, perhaps, Miriam, if you can take the entire panel back on screen so that we can respond to some of the questions that have come in. And maybe if I could start with perhaps a more technical question to Christopher. There's a question in there about human rights, noting that water and sanitation are a recognized and endorsed human right. In the set of values, where is the space of the survey? Where is the space there for human rights type of values?
Yeah, so I guess if we look at human rights, one first question might be, which human right are we talking about? So different human rights may activate different values.
This particular one on water and sanitation.
Yeah, oh, water and sanitation, okay. So water and sanitation, that is a way that would enter into the assigned values. So thinking, how does water matter to us? It matters to us, so we can use it in our homes. So in that sense, providing that value would enter into the framework and level of assigned values. But whether we choose to work towards that goal, that will be influenced by our personal values. So applying that case to our framework would work in that way.
Yeah, and I found it interesting myself, having just learned from Christopher this difference between personal values and assigned values, where personal values are, if you will, intrinsic, and assigned values is there is a particular good that I then decide to value highly. And that good can be a right, but it can also be a thing, such as forests. In Germany, we think forests are quite important, so we assign them a big value. Many other countries do that too. Water, we often forget. There was a question, I think, that I would like to direct to either Lucy or Anna Maria about the Katuma project. They wanted to know an example of a concrete situation that you did differently or would have done differently if values had not played a role in how you were designing your engagement. I can't actually see you right now, but I'm assuming you're still there. Who of you would want to speak to that question? Lucy?
Yeah, sure. So the question was an example, what did you do differently because of this values approach? I think for us was just recognizing early on the need to both embrace water's multiple values and reconcile these by building the trust through convening the catchment stakeholders and develop a vision for integrated water resource management. Then ensuring inclusive participation and equitable decision-making with an emphasis to understand water use and water users and monitor what helped ensure actions that were adopted. Capacity building as well to water stakeholders was a key component.
But Lucy, if I may interrupt you, is this not all by now part of good project design? That one would always make sure that it is participatory, that it is particularly inclusive of groups that are otherwise excluded? Aren't these good standards for a good project? And what would you have done differently had values there not played a role? Assuming that this would have been just good practice.
Yeah, I think for the project, what we could have done different is just that we share an understanding of the problem, what the problem is. So ensuring first, because there were also the issues, people the communities downplaying the problem to begin with. And because of these different power structures and the influence some businesses had. So early on, bringing the different users in the catchment area together to understand what the problem is and then work from there. Of course, all the other elements are essential to any project design, but bringing the commonalities and understanding early on to where are the issues and how can we tackle this, I think is important, whether you are applying the Valley Water principles or not.
Thank you.
Yeah. And yeah, so I just wanted to say, if I can add, is that I think that one important element that relates to values is really being aware that others in the room may have and will have different values to yourself. And I think bringing that to the surface helps, bring people to different understanding of the people they're sitting around, and kind of it helps a compass movement, I think. So it is about like kind of bringing to the fore that concept of I have my values, but that person sitting across from me may not have the same values as me, and actually, I'm open to understanding what their values are, so that then together we can come to an understanding that helps all of us benefit from the decisions that are made in this room.
And if I may dig a little bit deeper in here, does this require a different facilitation approach? When you're orchestrating, if you will, participatory project design, and you want to speak about values, and we'll come to that with Sanjay and Meseret in a moment also, because it would seem to me that if you are spending time considering what are my values, what are your values, why are these my values, am I open to other people's value judgments because I respect them, that this requires, if not extra time, but perhaps also different techniques. What would you respond to that?
Yeah, I would say it does. It's also, I mean, I think it goes, I think a lot of the time, especially in our field of, nature conservation, ecosystem conservation, you end up spending a lot of time on the science. And here, what you're doing is taking a step back from the science and really using that to understand what the people are gaining from that situation. And so it does require, okay, you can be, the decisions, you can put in front, the discussion can start based on what the science is around, what are benefits that you can get from specific developments. But at the same time, it's really looking at how each person stands to gain or lose from which decision is made. And actually then bringing people to understand that actually we can find a place where everyone feels like they are gaining, so they are benefiting from that decision.
Yeah.
And so I think that's how it changes.
Even though perhaps not everybody benefits the same or might like to have benefited more, there is that value of being part of a positive process here, it seems to me. Now, Sanjay and Messi, there was a question to you about whether the values angle has been made explicit in the process that you were engaged in. And knowing a bit more about what you're doing is, I would have said it was perhaps made so explicit that I've always wondered that people didn't run away from you when you invited them to engage here. And maybe Messi is the best one to start with that, because you were right in this. What was your reaction when somebody said, come and go on a journey that is about values?
Yeah, well, it's kind of very confrontational in its nature, because people don't like to, okay, not people, but some people may not like to, face their values or explore into themselves what they stand for and everything. It's kind of a question that really needs to be answered, but may not be answered by a person at all times. So it was confrontational for me and difficult in the beginning. but then through the process, it gave me courage really to, it's a different way of looking things. It's kind of an inspiration, it's like going deeper into yourself and see if you can contribute in some way, in a positive way, not just by being forced or by being lectured or by being, directed towards something. It's just you and your ability to do something, your desire to do something. Basically, desire is there, when there is desire, and as we all know, everything is really easy to accomplish. So values in the whole FLL training, we actually go deeper into values. Values were very much explicit. We explore values very much to the point where people has to stop and think, what are my values? Do I really have them? Or was I just saying I have this and I have that, but I really don't have them? So they were very much explicit in the process.
Thank you. And maybe if I can turn over to Sanjay with the same question that I just asked Anna Maria, was the facilitation technique for these conversations amongst staff that you have seen very different to other projects that you may have seen that involved staff engagement or mobilization to improve performance? And can you point to one or two things that were specific in the style or the approach or the time taken for that? Sanjay?
Thanks, Monica. Very interesting question. I want to make a distinction between what we try to do and what actually happens. They're very different things. So there are all kinds of people in every organization. Let's be very clear-eyed about it. That when a disaster happens somewhere, there are people in the organizations who want to enrich themselves and take that money and put it in their bank account. They exist. And there are also people who work Saturdays, Sundays, late nights to help the people who are in need. Now, all those people are in your organization or in your ecosystem. And when you talk to them and have this open conversation about values, somebody's not going to raise their hand and say, my value is to just care for myself. They never say that. So they will answer, they will give you the answers that you want to hear. And it actually doesn't matter, because what matters is that the good guys can see each other and they can start connecting with each other. So although you use values as a conversation starter, the big thing that's happening is the opportunity for people to connect with each other who did not have that opportunity. And that, you don't know where that will lead to. For example, what happened in Addis, that people figured out, hey, the poorest neighborhoods are only getting less than 1 day per week of water supply, and we can increase that to 3. This didn't come from the top. This is organic achievements, and that is what matters more than actually lecturing and discussing about values. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think just for the rest of us, one of the things that I have learned from Sanjay in preparing for this is the question that perhaps was raised, or at least the way he explained it to me, was, what do you get up for in the morning? That people have 1 day a week water, or that they have 3 days a week hour. So that personal motivation there can play a big role. Now, Christopher, quick question to you, just also for the audience where people have asked for more reading. Can you point us also to other research that would further substantiate that if one works making values explicit, that can change decision making?
Yes, I'm happy to do that. So I should say what I have presented is based on a lot of previous research that has been published in research papers, and we can share them in the chat. But we are also planning to write this up in a policy-friendly way or practitioner-friendly way for the next year. So everyone who participates in our survey will be notified once we have also written this up in a more accessible way, rather than in the write-up of an academic paper. But we will certainly share those in the chat.
But to come to that point, is there other research out there that substantiates this further?
Oh, sorry. Yes. So on the psychology part of it, there's a lot of research that has been established very well. So that wheel that I was showing earlier about the 10 basic values, that has been tested in almost every country of the world, basically. In terms of linking those values to water, that is a new field that hasn't been done very much. Apart from my own group, there have been other people looking at it, but with a different understanding of what values means. So really, this is something we are looking to continue working on for the coming years. And we hope that this can be the start of the process of substantiating it further, of how values matter in all the different decisions that can be taken around water. There are some studies on very clear cases like building dams, where you can say very clearly a dam supports economic development, but it does do some damage to the ecosystems, where you find people are.
Whoops, I think the Cambridge bandwidth has been hitting us again.
Yeah.
If that's okay, we'll ask Christopher to put the rest of the references for other research into the chat. And just in concluding, I would like to ask all of our panel members for a yes or no and a number. The yes or no is, now that you have worked on projects that involve values and making them explicit, are you trying to incorporate making values explicit also in other projects that you work in? On a scale between 0 and 10, do you find it easy, which would be 1, or difficult, that would be 10? So I'm going to start with our Katuma team and then move over to the FLL team and then go to Martin and Christopher. So yes or no, Sanjay, are you trying to make values explicit also in other projects? And do you find it easy? And you can only get to say yes or no and a number. Sanjay?
No, not on economic values, not on personal values, but just shaking the ecosystem is what we look for.
Okay, and do you find it easy or difficult to make that explicit?
It's easier now with approaches like FLL.
Okay, so I'm not getting a number. No. My great success as a moderator. Messi, in the other work areas that you're in, are you also there trying to make values explicit, yes or no? And do you find it easy or difficult? And maybe you can give us a number for that. Messi?
So since I like FLL very much, I would say yes. And it's easy, I would say 1 if you want a number. So,
because you already have that environment. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Anna Maria?
Yeah, I would say yes, for sure. I'm not sure I would give it a 1 though, probably more like a 5. It can be easy, but I think you need to get people to the right frame of mind.
Thank you. Lucy?
Yes, I would also say yes, but in terms of how easy it is, it's quite complex and it takes a lot of moving parts. So I would say 5 or 6.
Thank you. Martin?
Yes, I think what we are developing with the Valiant Water initiative is this values lens, and we think that it is a very useful addition to all the existing paradigms, whether it's WRM or water stewardship or water footprinting or whatnot, or utility reform. So yes, we try to actively promote that because we believe it is useful. And in particular, Christopher had these different levels of values. Not at every level will you find agreement, but if there is at least one level, a fundamental level maybe, where you do agree, then there is a basis for a more constructive reaching of agreement, of reconciliation of values. Is it easy? Not at all. I think it is on a scale of 0 to 10, with 10 very difficult. I would rate it at 7, but it's useful and it's intriguing.
Thank you. Do we have Christopher back? Are you?
Yes, again, sorry.
Yeah, the question is probably mute with you because all your research is on values right now, right?
Yes, so we are definitely making them.
And do you find it easy or difficult as a subject?
I would say as a subject, it is relatively easy 8, but making an impact, making a change, that is hard, and I would go for a 5.
Yeah, and that is kind of funny because I would have probably given the difficulty a 12 or something, just given that people have so many different values right now. Now, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for staying with us for such a long time and exploring and digging deeper into the valuing topic. We will post all the slides as well as any other information we have, and a couple of people have asked for that. There was a final question on an overlap with the behavior change approaches. We can explore that in the informal follow-up discussion. So I think the way I understand this will function, and maybe Miriam, you can explain that further. We're now concluding the formal part of the session, and I believe this is then also the recorded part of the session. But the speakers have kindly agreed to stay with us for another 15-20 minutes. For anyone who has informal questions, you can send them by chat directly or interact verbally with us. But the formal part of the session is over now. But let me not conclude this without saying thank you not only to our venerable panel, but also to those who participated, and in particular to the organizers of Stockholm Water Week, who have yet again given us a chance to meet virtually this year. Something that, while I have always enjoyed being in Stockholm, I find so much more accessible for so many more people. And I am glad we had a chance to run this session, which I think is taking us all forward in our consideration about where can we make valuing water practicable, where can we deploy it, where can we take steps forward towards valuing water more in a reflection of those that use it today, in the future, and in many different parts of the world. So thank you all. And now, Miriam, I'm turning it over